Since this video was recorded after the CCP Congress, I want to give a quick recap and share some of my thoughts. First of all, the new Central Committee member and the Politburo is a landslide for Xi Jinping, which is kind of what people expected. Based on my count, except for 2 members from the military, half of the Politburo members have held government jobs that overlap Xi's term in Fujian and Zhejiang province. The other half are well-known technocrats with almost impeccable resume. For example, Chen Jining, the current mayor of Beijing, has a PhD in environmental science from Imperial College London. Another Politburo member, Yuan Jiajun, used to be the lead engineer and chief commander of the Chinese space program. Having worked with Xi is definitely a huge bonus for one's career, but you also need to have some talents under your belt. Secondly, I don't see any Politburo standing member as potential candidate to succeed Xi Jinping. They all look like senior assistants to the boss. In the past few months, I found Western scholars started to become interested again in the so-called 七上八下 rule in Chinese Communist Party. It is an unwritten rule that says anyone above 68 should retire, while those under 67 can still serve another term at senior position. Remarks commonly heard are that by breaking the 七上八下 rule, Xi Jinping is now a rebel and he is on his way to true dictatorship. I tend to stop listening to the program if the host or the invited experts talk about 七上八下 with full seriousness, because I think it simply shows how unfamiliar they are with Chinese politics in the past 2 decades. Jiang Zemin, the Communist Party leader from 1989 to 2002, was appointed by Deng Xiaoping to fill in the leadership vacuum after the upheaval of 1989. Before 1989, he was just the mayor of Shanghai. As a total stranger of the top leadership circle in the capital, Jiang's original plan was to put an age ceiling of 70 for the party leadership, and it later came to be known as 七上八下. The rule was mainly targeted at party elders who didn't see eye to eye with Jiang, especially Qiao Shi and later Li Ruihuan. As an anecdote, Li Ruihuan was a professional carpenter before joining the party leadership. He became famous after he published a book about calculation used in carpentry, and there was even a movie about him at the time. Okay, back to 七上八下. Instead of fostering stability and predictability, like many people would imagine, the rule quickly turned into a joke when Jiang himself and his allies didn't play by the rule themselves. Although the rule was followed by Hu Jintao, Jiang's successor, mainly because at the time Hu was surrounded by Jiang's old pals, and their promotion and retirement had already been planned years ahead. Think about it. Nowadays, ordinary people can easily live until their 80s and 90s. If you are a leader who has worked so hard to climb to the top of the mountain, and suddenly you are told to go back because next year you will turn 68, at the peak of your capability and experience. It's a bad thing for the morale of the party, and it's also a big waste of human resources. So in my opinion, the fact that Xi broke the rule is not an aberration, but a return to common sense. I guess a real disappointment from the new Politburo is the absence of any female member. In the past 20 years, there has always been a female member who is in charge of foreign policy or healthcare. Although the role is mostly ceremonial, I think it's still a kind gesture. That was quite a long recap. Now I want to talk about how the party and the government officials are selected and promoted, something I touched on a little bit last time. If you're like me, who look up people's resume for fun, you will notice that the recently selected party leaders more or less followed a similar trail. They usually start from being a lecturer at a university or an engineer at a factory. As a reward for their good performances, they were allowed to join the Communist Party, and maybe a real party as well. Who knows? Yes, I know it sounds weird, but it is still true today that you can only apply to join the CCP with the recommendation of a CCP current member. It's seen as a privilege rather than a personal choice. This humble background kind of harkens back to the early days of the CCP when they were very popular among young students and factory workers. After a few years at the university or factory, one may get appointed to be the district mayor or the city mayor. By then, he or she is still a small fish in the pond, until he or she gets promoted to be the governor of a province. Basically, you go from 1 out of 293 to 1 out of 23. That's why the reshuffling of province governors is always a bellwether to changes at the highest level. Almost all new Politburo members come with a series of leadership titles in key provinces. If the provinces are the midterms, then the city of Shanghai is like the final exam. A city with 24 million people, by far the most important economic center of China, and the birthplace of the CCP, Shanghai is overburdened by its many titles. That's why being the party secretary of Shanghai is like the ultimate testament of one's overall capability and loyalty to the party. I've always been interested in seminars and research reports about how Chinese politics operate and how officials are selected. I want to know what other people think. I give my admirations to the political scientists who use quantitative tools to analyze the makeup of the Central Committee or average length of party leaders' tenure in office and use the model to make predictions. But I have to say, the results might be heavily biased. Remember, when the People's Republic of China was established in 1949, the leaders were by all standards very young. Deng Xiaoping was only 45 when he became member of the first Politburo in 1949. Some early party leaders even lived to witness the second millennial. It's no surprise that up to 1990s, the operation of the government and selection of officials were heavily interfered by party elders. Therefore, only less than 30 years of party politics and leadership changes can be seen as meaningful to observe for patterns, and to be honest, any conclusion from it is unlikely to be future-proof. That being said, I think there are a few trends that are going to stay in the long term. The first one is that top jobs like the prime minister and the vice premier in charge of economy come almost exclusively from the more developed southeast provinces like Zhejiang, Jiangsu, and Guangdong. In the early days of PRC, there used to be a decent number of Politburo members from the north, but now it has dwindled to single digits, running the military and propaganda machine on Xi's behalf. It cannot be a pure coincidence that in ancient China, the north contributed leaders and warriors, while the south contributed money masters. One outlier is Wang Qishan. He is from the north and has a governor background in the north. But later he became the president of a state-owned bank, the deputy governor of Guangdong during the Asian financial crisis in 1997, and the mayor of Beijing during the SARS crisis in 2004. A fascinating person. Last time I talked about how the party and government roles are intertwined. I think this is something Xi wants to change as well. Between a capable staff working within the party system and a practitioner in local governments, he has a clear preference to the latter. One has to prove himself a capable governor before he or she be promoted within the party, not the other way around. Again, this is not a contemporary idea, but can be traced back to the Song dynasty and even earlier times. In early Song dynasty, a person's rank in government is totally separate from his actual job. However, only the rank dictates how much a person earns. As a result, there were people who do nothing all day but earn much more than someone who works like a workaholic. A government reform later fixed this issue by zipping the two more closely together so that the ranking could reflect the actual workload of an official. Another trend, although a lot of people would disagree, is the shift of power between the president and the premier, and further, a separation of role between the party and the government. According to the Chinese constitution, the PRC president is just a ceremonial position, similar to that president of Germany and Italy. There was even a period of time when China didn't have a president. The idea was, to borrow a line from a movie, don't you know who the real boss is? In fact, during Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao's time, China was moving towards a more premier-oriented government. But this was also the time when the government was plagued by party infighting and corruption. That's why I think when Xi came to power, he was determined to clear the house in his own way. And to do that, he had to re-centralize power to the president, which is him. He did first in the army, then the tax system, and now into the deep water of the economy. I think he gets a lot of inspiration from Wang Anshi, a famous politician and reformer in the Song dynasty. I encourage my audience to read about him online. You will find a striking similarity to what's going on in China right now. It's almost like a parallel universe. Xi Jinping's policies and reforms look like patches pasted on old and new loopholes in society. But in my opinion, they are the pre-steps to a higher goal, which is to establish a healthy and sustainable political order in China. You may think that, with 2,000 years of emperor rule, the one-man rule is too strong that China has become a monolith with only one brain and one voice. This may be true when the dynasty is at its heyday, but whenever the central power weakens, by invaders or by its own fault, China would quickly dissolve and turn into chaos. Peasants start killing each other until the most brutal one conquered everyone else and became the new ruler. Absolute power always ends up in absolute chaos. The writings of Karl Marx and Frederick Engels provide the CCP with basic communist theory, but they did not provide any practical guidance on how to escape China's big historical cycle. What appears to be solidarity can turn into disorder overnight. I believe Xi wants to leave behind him a government whose power has limit. Seeing his father purged, he himself a victim of the Cultural Revolution, Xi is well aware of the disaster of power gone wild. I don't see a peaceful way for the CCP to simply give up its power. Xi is more than keen on keeping the CCP alive. He actually sees himself as saving the party from all its illness. But to limit power and at the same time keep the CCP afloat is a Herculean undertaking. In some books, this type of challenge is referred to as an exit route of history. At the very least, Xi needs to leave policy-making solely to the government and have the party be a kind of symbol of the country. Sounds like what happened to all constitutional monarchies, right? Well, in China's case, the CCP will always be much more than a symbol, like the King of England. On his third term, I'm looking forward to see if he will transfer some of his personal power to the State Council, the main government body of China. The state council will soon be led by Li Qiang, a very pragmatic person in my observation. He is well trusted by Xi, so I think if things go well between the two, Xi will be willing to take a backseat. This is in contrary to what most people see going to happen. Again, I'm assuming nothing major happened like war with Taiwan or another crisis like COVID. If either of those happen, I'm sure Xi will take the wheel by himself immediately. Before I end, I want to spend a little more time on this relationship between party and government leadership in China. Nowadays, every big state or private company in China has a Communist Party branch office, absorbing new members and hold occasional so-called study sessions. They're like Bible study in the US, but it's about the latest announcements from the CCP. Seems to be just a propaganda machine on steroids, right? But because the language used by the party is so dry and arcane, the propaganda actually created a subculture that, on the surface, people give warm praises to the party, posting patriotic slogans on social media, but in private, no one really gives a damn. They're just paying lip service so as to not get into trouble. If you think this is ridiculous, then you have to read on how in the Mao era, the CCP didn't only tell you what to say, it also made decisions for you, like what you should study or whom you should marry. For example, Yuan Longping, the pioneer of rice crossbreeding in China, was almost jailed in the 50s because he followed the approach of Western genetic biologists like Mendel and Morgan, rather than that of the Soviet scientist, from which the PRC tried to copy in every aspect. It was only because of the famine of 1959 and the deterioration of Sino-Soviet relationship that Yuan got an exception that he can follow the quote-unquote capitalist scientific approach. I think the fact that he never joined the CCP until he passed away in 2021 is quite a manifesto of his political stand. There were numerous examples like this, where the party became a threat to the very basis of market economy and scientific research. As I mentioned, the CCP knows that it cannot rule by a dictatorship, so they need a decent, even glorious way out. I believe the CCP is willing to stay within the realm of ideology, giving scientists and entrepreneurs more power and freedom, as long as they keep an eye on the boundary of speech and gives credits to the party. It's actually a win-win. But again, this transition will take years, even decades, to come to fruition, and it can stop at any moment by a war or crisis. I know I'm portraying the CCP in a relatively positive and even progressive light, like it's trying to fix itself from within. Looking at the recent record of social media shushing, one can easily say I'm too naive. Maybe I am. I don't like the Chinese society the way it is right now, but I have a deep affection for the civilization. Modern China is only 30 to 40 years of that civilization. I see a momentum in China similar to Chile under Allende in 1970 and Iran under Mossadegh in 1951. Both had an agenda for modernization and protection of national interest. But even before their assassinations by the CIA, they were criticized for becoming more and more like dictators, and their reputations irreversibly injured because of the painful but necessary reforms they carried out. If the public could have a bit more patience, a bit more faith, the opportunity for political and social change might not be thrown out so easily. Since the death of both, Chile and Iran had entered a long period of dictatorship rule, and it will take decades before another window of opportunity opens.